feel the finding of the Pyramid Village and Cemetery does not prove that they built the Great Pyramid. If the Great Pyramid stood alone with no other monuments around it, and this workforce village was found, I could more easily believe they manufactured it. But the Great Pyramid is surrounded by smaller pyramids, temples, buildings, and the Sphinx, many of which were built at different times. It is not unreasonable to expect that all the construction projects going on over time that a village of workers would pop up at some point. Egyptologists tie the construction of the Great Pyramid to the pharaoh Khufu, mainly because of some graffiti on top of the king's chamber put there by one of Khufu's worker gangs. This writing was not found until the 1800s, and stories have circulated that the graffiti was a counterfeit placed there by the archaeologists working in the king's chamber. Evidence they cite for this is that the pharaoh Khufu's name is misspelled in the graffiti. Further evidence that suggests that the pharaoh Khufu didn't build the Great Pyramid comes from the pharaoh himself. A stone carving known as the Inventory Stela found between the paws of the Sphinx states that Khufu and Khafre, the pharaohs associated with building the two larger pyramids in the Giza complex, only made repairs to the already ancient structures. Furthermore, there is no evidence that the Great Pyramid was used as a tomb for the pharaoh, which is what Egyptologists claim. Herodotus, the Greek historian from the 5th century BC, wrote that the pharaoh Khufu was buried in a subterranean region on an island surrounded by the Nile River, and not in the Great Pyramid. Other historical sources also claim Khufu was buried in an obscure place. The only coffin found near the pyramids was found under one of the Queen's Pyramids. The Queen's Pyramids are a small grouping of four pyramids, of which only three are still standing. The fourth was only found when the excavations revealed the first course of stones from its base. Around this pyramid was the tomb of Queen Hetepheres, the mother of Khufu. The burial was intact, but when they opened the sealed coffin, it was empty. The Great Pyramid appears to have remained unopened from the time of Khufu until 820 AD, when Arabs under the direction of Caliph al-Ma'mun tunneled into the pyramid and found the descending passageway. Exploring this passageway, they found the ascending passage blocked by gigantic plugs. They tunneled around the plugs and continued on to find the queen and king's chambers. The Arabs would find nothing of value in these chambers: no treasure, no mummies, no inscriptions, no indication that anything was there except for the empty, broken granite box that would be called the empty coffin. There would be a later account by an Arab named Idrisi, who died in 1166 AD, who entered the Great Pyramid through the tunnel made in 820 AD. He went on to describe the empty coffin in the king's chamber. Surprisingly, he mentions that there was another empty box similar to the one in the king's chamber in the queen's chamber. It is unknown what happened to this artifact. 1637 saw the first scientific study of the Great Pyramid. It was conducted by Professor John Greaves from Oxford University in England. He published the first book specifically about the Great Pyramid in 1798. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte led a military expedition to Egypt. He also came to Egypt with archaeologists, astronomers, artists, engineers, and surveyors. They combed the Great Pyramid, taking measurements and making drawings of it. Their work done in Egypt would be published from 1809 to 1822. One of the greatest finds in archaeology would come from this expedition. Napoleon's archaeologists would find the Rosetta Stone. This inscripted stone would have three alphabets on it: hieroglyphics, Hermetic, and Greek. This would allow for the first time modern archaeologists to have the ability to translate the hieroglyphics that adorned the many monuments and buildings of Egypt. Napoleon instructed his men to leave him alone in the king's chamber, and when he came out he looked visibly shaken. When one of his aides asked him if he had seen anything mysterious, he stated that he had no comment and that he never wanted the incident mentioned again. A close friend to Napoleon asked him what had happened in the pyramid years later when Napoleon was on his deathbed. Napoleon started to answer, but stopped, shook his head, and said, "What is the use? You'd never believe me." The nature of the event that spooked Napoleon will probably never be known. It doesn't appear that he told anyone what occurred that day, but other famous people spent time also in the pyramid. Alexander the Great and Aleister Crowley. Crowley claimed A magical light had shone about him in the pyramid when he spent his honeymoon there in 1872 saw the British engineer Wayman Dixon investigating the shafts in the Queen's chamber. In one of the shafts he found a ball of black diorite and a bronze implement of unknown purpose. These objects now reside in the British Museum. There are three boat-shaped pits around the Great Pyramid, and it was assumed that at one time they may have held complete boats. Confirmation of this happened in May of 1954 when Egyptian archaeologist Kamal el-Malak discovered a fourth pit still covered with the 15-ton slab of stone. When the slabs were removed, they found 1,224 pieces of wood. These pieces were disassembled parts of a boat. They commissioned local boat builder Haj Ahmed Yosef to piece together the boat and rebuild it. The entire process, including restoration and straightening of the wood, took 14 years. When completed, a 143-foot cedar boat emerged, its timbers held together by ropes. The boat now resides in a specially built air-conditioned museum next to the Great Pyramid. During the construction of the museum, a second unopened boat pit was found. They left it unopened to preserve it until better excavation techniques could be developed. One interesting mystery about the Great Pyramid is there is no visible evidence that was ever broken in prior to 820 AD when the Arabs tunneled through the blocks of stone until they found a passageway. So if the pyramid was robbed shortly after the time of Khufu, how did they get in? And if they broke into it, who repaired the pyramid, and why bother repairing an empty tomb? So far, the only artifact in the Great Pyramid that suggests something was put in and later removed is the empty coffin or stone box, which has no lid, and one of its corners is chipped and appears broken into. The great debate is what was in it. Did it have mummies or treasure, or did the pyramid have a different function altogether? Josephus, the Jewish historian, who was born around 37 AD, writes in his book Antiquities of the Jews that the sons of Seth had invented a peculiar sort of wisdom, which was concerned with heavenly bodies and their order, basically astronomy. Josephus goes on to maintain that Adam had predicted that the world would be destroyed once by fire and another time by water. Josephus states that the sons of Seth made two pillars that they inscribed their discoveries upon, one of brick and the other of stone. The stone pillar was a backup to the brick pillar in case the flood destroyed it. The stone pillar also makes reference to the brick pillar's existence. Josephus claimed that the remains of the pillar resided in the land of Syriad to this day. The land of Syriad is thought to be Egypt, and therefore one of their ancient monuments was thought to be one of the pillars. Syriad might also refer to Syria. If that's the case, then one of the pillars may be in the city of Baalbek, which is built upon giant stone blocks. The two pillars may have been built in separate areas. This is probably likely since Josephus states that the pillar of stone makes mention of the pillar of brick. If they built them together, there would be no need to mention the other. So if the pillar of brick was in Egypt, which ancient structures existing at that time could it have been? The Great Pyramid stands out as the best candidate due to its astronomical and mathematical alignments and the level of precision in its construction. The purpose of the pillars was to preserve astronomical knowledge for future generations after the flood. This would have also included mathematical concepts, which the Great Pyramid is also encoded with. Around the Great Pyramid's base is a 14-foot layer of silt sediment which has shells and manatee fossils. When the Arabs opened the Great Pyramid in 820 AD, they found a thick layering of salt in the inner passageways. Most of the salt naturally formed on the walls, but later when the salt was analyzed, parts of the salt was found to be sea salt. This would mean that at some point in time the Great Pyramid was underwater. The layer of salt only goes up halfway up the pyramid. This may suggest that a later flood surrounded the pyramid but only reached halfway to the top. The empty sarcophagus may have contained books or tablets that would have had the knowledge of the sons of Seth. They may have been removed at a time shortly after the flood. There has been speculation that the Great Pyramid was a sort of power plant and that the ancients had used to harness energy, and that the empty coffin is a control panel. Other theories suggest it was built as a tomb, but not for Egyptian pharaohs, but for the resting place of Adam, the first man. Some feel the sarcophagus is empty because apocryphal sources and legends state that no